One of the bigger discussions for Season 4 has been the changes for the Elemental Druid, with a lot of it being fairly overblown for clickbait, but it also comes along with a few questions about specific items for both the Fire Druid and Wind Druid in terms of chance to cast. So today we're going to look at a couple builds and how they differ from back in the day, if at all. Starting out, while I go into much more detail on the builds in their individual videos, which I'll throw the links to the ones I've done in the description, I should probably give the more Cliff Notes version of them here, which generally just comes down to item choices and skills. Starting with the standard elementalist, the Wind Druid is probably still the most popular, even though Fire has caught up with it for the most part thanks to endgame gear, and it focuses on one of the two flavors, with the one that got little to no bonuses in patch 2.7 being the hurricane-centered one, that focuses on plus skills and minus cold resist on gear and even plus cold damage, that maxes out hurricane damage with things like Nightwing's Veil and Doom, with rainbow facets to squeeze out a little bit more maximum cold damage and a little bit more pierce. And while that one didn't change much, the other one is getting much more attention due to the next hit delay change, and that is the Tornado-focused Druid. It basically relegates Hurricane to more of a support role for chilling and slowing nearby enemies and dealing with physical immunes, of course. This build instead focuses on faster casts to spam as many tornadoes as possible, with Heart of the Oak, Spirit, etc. being the big tools of the trade. Now, there's discussion as to how much of a boost this really is though, and really it's a mixed bag that happens to have interesting perks thanks to Twister being on the list of skills affected by it as well. For Tornado itself though, you will see a boost in damage if you're able to get the proper tornado collision on the enemy, but against harder to hit enemies it will be about the same as before since it does an area of effect tick, and that is what gave most of its damage before. But against larger enemies like Wendigos, Act Bosses, etc., spamming this will be faster than before thanks to the damage of the tornado itself actually hitting the target each time you cast, rather than once per about a second. So better for bosses, but you will not notice much difference playing through areas like, say, Flare Jungle. Twister on the flip side does not have area of effect ticks, instead functioning more like Charge Bolt, where if it hits, albeit with far less damage. The reason it gets a perk on this though is that it steps into the role of skills like Shockwave, since you can spam it and maintain a stun now, and it will do damage every cast rather than every second. And due to being a spread attack, it's a lot easier to stack on targets and can be a lifesaver with its stun now. I have oddly found it way more satisfying than before, at least when dealing with trash packs like Fallen, Flares, and Bloodhawks whenever I'm trying to kill them, where they show up in swarms and spread out. They're even handy for dolls since you can now stun lock them and move away compared to Tornado where RNG just hates me and steers away from them even when they're right next to me. On the Fire side, ignoring the chance to cast builds for the moment, it's pretty much going to boil down to picking your favorite fire skills and stacking them just hard, with personal favorites of mine being Fissure on right click, Molten Boulder on left, and Armageddon just constantly running. The big change to this tree though, you're going to see them in Volcano and Fissure, which are both really solid skills, and as far as gear goes, you can get faster casts for teleporting if you have Enigma, but this build usually does just focus on maximizing that fire damage and plus skills first. With the change, the improvement is mostly in the case of toggling between Fissure and Volcano though, which means it's going to be more favorable for people who use quick casts since it lets you just spam between them rather than people who use hotkeys where you have to press 2 keys to do the same thing. This is because, unlike Wind, these skills have casting delays, so you won't have a lot of either skill out while hard casting even though they are area of effect and randomly casting, and even toggling between them you only have so many out. In testing against some enemies, namely stationary ones, stacking these up did improve things because you'll have the Fissures and the Volcanoes shooting in the same locations each time you cast it if you don't move, so you can stack them up and they will just continually cast on that spot in a chain kind of situation and not interrupt each other. But against those things, those are more the exception than the rule, and the build is still just about where it was before against most normal enemies, albeit maybe slightly faster against bosses like we said. Needless to say, Wind was more of an improvement. Now, in terms of what keeps coming up on videos and what people keep telling me to go watch and kind of give my opinion on, it's chance to cast stuff, which has been asked about, like I said, quite a few times in the comments. While I haven't made a video covering them, I have tested both the wind and fire version even in previous patches. And while fun and quirky, they fall into the same realm as the Fireworks Barbarian, albeit slightly more viable, in that for the same level gear you can get slightly better effects and output by just going into the more standard versions of the build, rather than stacking on weapons like Destruction or Windhammer. And it is worth noting, both of those are actually fine weapons for the builds, it's just there's better options for the budget selections like Windhammer, and there's better expensive options than Destruction. The goals of these builds is basically to bump the synergies of the chance to cast abilities and go for it. So in the end, the only one that I would even remotely consider would maybe be Carrion Wind for the occasional stun effect, since even things like Stormlash don't feel like they provided much of a difference in kill speed compared to previous patches, with just going a normal standard build with that weapon. Now, there is nothing wrong with these builds, and while people are picking up on them a bit more in 2.7 thanks to the decoupling of next hit delays, the improvement is just not really enough to worry about sensationalism or such for them, and sadly didn't do enough to justify the time investment for a proper guide on that specific one outside of saying, you make a Fireclaw Druid, but change the gear slightly, in the case of Destruction Druids, or for the Wind, it's basically make a Fury Druid, but change the gear slightly. And while you can do Fury with a Destruction Druid, I do actually prefer Fireclaw, since it reduced the struggle with bosses significantly, and it's not really a struggle, it just speeds it up a lot, and it didn't really impact much in the way of crowd clearing unless you are doing something where you are just completely surrounded, which if you're a smart melee player, you should actually have them clumped on your side rather than on every side. So all that said, do you think the changes to the Druid were more significant than I think? Do you actually want a video to cover the chance to cast of Wind and Fire Druids even though they're not much different than the base builds? Mention it down below, and also mention builds you want me to take a look at in the future as well, since while I'm dipping into the weird and quirky stuff for testing, I'm always up for something fun and strange that might surprise me.